From the murder of law lecturer Edgar Graham on the 7th of December 1983 outside the law faculty offices in Queen's University, Belfast, to the murder of my law student Sheena Campbell on the 16th of October 1992, the Faculty of Law at Queen's experienced some extraordinary and tragic times. My argument today is there's much to learn about legal education in ordinary times and places by reflection on the experiences of students and staff in those exceptional circumstances, not only between those two murders, for which, by the way, nobody's ever been charged, but from the 1960s to the turn of the millennium and beyond. After all, many law school experiences revolve around drawing lessons for everyday life from hard, or as I prefer to put it, uneasy cases. And this reflection applies that mindset to law school characters themselves. Here is a timeline of how, on the left-hand side, things were happening at Queen's. With any luck, you won't be able to see it. Don't worry about it. And on the right-hand side, things that were happening in my life, things I was doing and writing. And the upshot is that Judith Eve became the dean in 1986. Mary McAleese became the director of the Professional Institute of Legal Studies in 1987. I was interviewed for the Professor of Jurisprudence post in 1988 and joined on the 1st of January 1989. Lots of things happened, including in the community. I taught Sheena Campbell in her first year in 1991. We talked about the broadcasting restrictions on Sinn Féin, which was very much a current issue. And in 1992, she was murdered. I was involved in the grassroots community initiative, the Upsell Commission Initiative 92, and that and other developments in the peace process led to the first IRA ceasefire in the summer of 1994, at which point it seemed like a good time to move. And I went to Liverpool Hope, and in 1998, the Omagh bomb went off, and one of our students at Hope was back home in Omagh. Her name was Susan Kelly. And what I wanted to say before I get on to the main two people I'm going to talk about is just a few things about some of the students that I encountered in those years. I can only talk about a few. So joining in the middle of an academic year, I just inherited two groups from Sir Colin Campbell, my predecessor. And all these students were fabulous in the two groups. It was on the sociology of law. And in one group, there were at least three superstars: Claire Archbold, Fionnuala Ní Éileann and Tony McGleenan, all of whom have gone on to hold professorships. Claire is a leading lawyer in the government legal service. Tony is a QC who often appears in the most serious cases in the highest courts. And Fionnuala is the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Nowadays, people most often ask me about two other undergraduates in that time, Arlene Foster and Siobhan Keegan, who became respectively the first woman First Minister of Northern Ireland and the first Lady Chief Justice of Northern Ireland. But there are other students who are doing amazing things on this side of the RSC from Queen's, such as Tony Murphy, who is the solicitor who helped Winston Silcott become free after miscarriage of justice, and who's involved currently in the success of the inquest calling to account those responsible for the sad death of Nadia Shaw, a schoolgirl who was detained under the Mental Health Act and died in a secure unit. But the mature undergraduates I knew best were Maurice Hayes at postgraduate level, who was the ombudsman and knew more about the LLM and human rights than any of us who were trying to teach him. And at undergraduate level, Sheena Campbell and Bernadette Grant. Sheena, as I say, I knew very well. Bernadette Grant, I wanted to mention, she was about my age now. She's in her 60s. She'd been a very successful teacher. And in retirement, she studied law. She was a counsellor in Omagh. And when the Omagh bomb went off 3 years later, I knew I was abroad, but I knew that I could phone Bernadette and she would go and see our student, Suzanne. So all of these characters made a huge difference to me. But I want to come on to the two people who you will perhaps have heard of. David Trimble, who became First Minister of Northern Ireland, won the Nobel Peace Prize and then was awarded the peerage, and Mary McAleese, who became the President of Ireland. So if we can go to the next slide, you'll see that, unbelievably, the biographers of David Trimble feel it's necessary in passing to say why he didn't become the professor of jurisprudence in 1988. This one shows you cannot trust the biographer who claims that I was a young left liberal Englishman, which really must worry you about what everybody else was like. If we move swiftly on from that, this book and this book, both about David Trimble, this one's 1,002 pages. They have quite a lot of criticisms of David Trimble when you think about it, considering how well he's done. And the three main ones, which I think are all misplaced, come in Dean Godson's biography, which I love in one respect, which we'll come to. But first of all, he says he's just a typical lawyer, a typical academic lawyer, would draft anything for an argument. He lost the deanship in 1986 to Judith Eve by 18 votes to 16 with 1 abstention. And my predecessor, Colin Campbell, told him he would never become a professor. So if we move on to the next slide, I'd just like to challenge those three things. The first one, this is what Dean Godson says, that he was playing intellectual games through his training as an academic lawyer. He would draft anything for the sake of an argument. But if we go to the next slide, and we're not going to play this, but perhaps I can put it in the chat box later on. There's a very, very similar comment, but put much more positively and kindly by a former student of mine at King's College London, Dame Bobby Chima Grubb, when she said, she's a High Court judge now, but she said one of the things she enjoyed about studying jurisprudence at university was being challenged and a devil's advocate or Socratic kind of way, and having to pivot in the course of a class. And the fact that David Trimble could put arguments on either side helped us very much when it came to the peace process. So the second criticism of him, if we can move on, is that he wasn't very good at academic politics, but then who wants to be? And this view of academic politics in a law school, that the jurisprudents vote one way and the black letter lawyers vote the other. I mean, what would that do to David Dennis, who's been prominent in the questioning as ever, who is both a black letter lawyer and a jurisprudent? There were other things at play here in this vote, and it's not the only deanship election that was highly contested. If you look at William Tyning, so William Tyning was my predecessor but one. If you look at his recent memoir, Jurist in Context, if we go to the next slide, he talks about how he came to Queen's, and the dean who approached him was called Francis Newark, but he'd become dean after Professor Louis Montrose lost a 4-3 vote after a mere 29 years in post. So I don't think David Trimble's minor defeat there was any different to what had been going on before. Of course, there were reasons why some people weren't that keen on Trimble. One is that he was very closely involved in the Ulster Workers' Council strike. This was a long time before, in 1974. And I brought along my copy of Houston Constitutional Law, which was the first constitutional law text I had. And apparently Trimble took it to the Ulster Workers' Council, where they were thrilled to have that account of martial law. So moving on to what happened next. The reason why he lost that election is possibly that he was pictured on the front page of the local unionist newspaper, tied to the railings outside Hillsborough Castle. But if we move on, I think that what hurt him a bit more was Colin Campbell allegedly telling him that he would never become a professor. Now, this seems to upset people even in law schools today, when somebody says, you're not going to do it until you publish more. Whether or not Campbell actually said that is slightly debated. But if we move to the next slide, what Dean Godson says, and this is why I've got several copies of this book, is that he didn't get the chair because he went to me. For some reason, this word superstar is put in quotes. So that seems to be because Dean Godson didn't think it was a proper word, rather than doubting whether I was in those days. But anyway, he didn't do badly. And I think today he would be a professor. But in those days, it was different. As I've said before, Tyning was headhunted. I was headhunted in a similar way. And although you went through an interview process, I think it was unlikely he'd get appointed then, but he would be appointed now under, for instance, the knowledge exchange track. I mean, you can't exchange much more knowledge than the leaders of the peace process did, and that's why they got the Nobel Peace Prize. But if we move on, I'm grateful to Dawn for doing all this. One of the questions is, why did Trimble not do very well in what we're going to call university politics? And he's given his own explanation in this biography. And you can see that he sees himself as an outsider. He's prepared to argue, and he thinks that that affects his career. There are other ways of interpreting it, but let's move on to Mary McAleese, who also comes in for a lot of criticism that she's allegedly not collegial, that she wasn't a real academic or a real practicing lawyer, and that she kept quiet when it suited her. Again, I think these are unfair. She says in her very recent autobiography that the law school atmosphere was collegial, eccentric, and fascinating. You think she was talking about the Open University today. She wasn't actually talking about, by the way, Queen's, either when she was a student or on the staff. She was talking about Trinity College, Dublin. But I think she had a point that that is how law schools should be. She explained that she didn't have a doctorate. She went from practice in the north to this odd post in a way in the south, and then into the media, and then back to that post, and then up to the professional institute. But you didn't have to have a doctorate. It wasn't necessary for Mary Robinson. Why should it be for Mary McAleese? And if we move on, one of the things is, if she didn't get, say, a senior lectureship or a professorship, she wouldn't be whinging about it too much. She would be disappointed, but she'd move on. So in her autobiography, she only mentions in passing a failed attempt to get elected at the Fianna Fáil general election. She was accused of double jobbing by the media unions because she was both an academic and a journalist. And she went back to lick her wounds after a controversy. But then, of course, again came this headhunting. All of this headhunting wouldn't be allowed now, but it happened then. And one of the other professors came to ask her to apply. And if we move on, she got that job, but questions were asked. Luckily, again, you can't see this, but 4 questions were asked in the House of Commons about her appointment, because not only did Trimble get beaten by Judith Eve and later by me on this interpretation of events, but in the middle, he lost this post to Mary McAleese. And so it's widely thought that his friends in the Unionist Party tabled some very hostile questions about what was Queen's doing here. If we move on. Justine McCarthy, who wrote a very blisteringly critical biography of Mary McAleese, again mentions me kindly in passing. And the criticism at this point was that Mary McAleese kept silent on some big issues. But then she became Pro-Vice Chancellor. So at that point, she was able to effect change and to affect what was going on. And shortly after that, she became President of Ireland. So choosing when to make a stand is not quite the same as running away from the issues. If we move on. So I and others were involved, as we saw it, doing the best we could in opening up Northern Ireland, but most of us didn't want to be in politics. Moving on. So I think there are lessons for law school life when you've seen over thousands of pages an academic lawyer described. And of course, they were students at Queen's as well. I've explained some of this. Blair, Clinton, Trimble, McAleese, later Obama, all were students of the law and have that approach to issues that Bobby Chima Grubb was describing in a positive way. They've all had some experiences that we tried to make as interesting as possible in Queen's. If we move on. And I think there are lessons which I can talk about in questions if you want to, about the law school. In other words, did we actually get the best out of David Trimble in the law faculty as traditionally conceived, and Mary McAleese in the professional institute, which was separate? We probably didn't. Now we're much more conscious about all kinds of diversity. And in particular, I'd like to think the invisible diversities, such as neurodiversity. But there are other kinds of diversity or divergent approaches, which we could call perhaps personality or politics divergent. And perhaps David Trimble and Mary McAleese found it difficult in the context of Queen's and the Troubles, or just of the university, to express themselves. They were probably frustrated. And so if we go on to the next slide, I think that the lessons are that we've encouraged students and one another in law schools to be imaginative, to be courageous, to be open-minded. But we can inadvertently sometimes close down the diversity. For instance, I think the core problem for David Trimble was that he was really a property lawyer in academic terms, but he wanted to be a constitutional lawyer, and he was commenting in that regard. And that's really why Queen's didn't want him to have the professor label. But why shouldn't you comment about both these areas if you are developing an expertise in them? I also think it's important, I'm coming to the end now, that you shouldn't just think of them always as they were as a student. Mary McAleese was the eldest in a big family. They were forced out of their home during her undergraduate years, during the Troubles. David Trimble was a mature student studying part-time and got an outstanding undergraduate result. So they were also part of what's been described as the resentful nationalist community in the case of Mary McAleese, in terms of belonging to the UK, really seeing themselves as Irish, or the precarious sense of belonging in the unionist community for David Trimble. But over time, they became more self-confident and enabled everybody else to be. And the final two things I want to say are that one of the connections through all this is that Sheena Campbell, the student who was murdered, was the candidate who lost to David Trimble. She was in the Upper Bank by-election in 1990. She was standing for Sinn Féin. She had a 9-year-old son at the time. I had 9-year-old and 8-year-old children. She would undoubtedly have been a leader of Sinn Féin and of Northern Ireland and of Ireland in the way in which Arlene Foster, Siobhan Keegan and others have been. And finally, I want to say that Mary McAleese has behaved, I think, with great dignity after stepping aside as president after 2 7-year terms. And what she says in her autobiography finally is that when you step down from office, in a republic of equals, you just get on back to regular life, just as it should be. And for her, no more high heels or elegant suits, just a hoodie, jeans, a backpack and a student card. She went to Rome, she learnt Latin and Italian, and she got her doctorate in canon law on the rights and obligations of children. And that's the measure of Mary McAleese and of David Trimble. And I think in similar ways, we can learn about each other in law schools when we track the biographies of those among us who have become famous. Thank you.